Okay. Okay. Hello. Hello. Buenas. Hola, Tom. Hello. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm going to be like very, very, very short because it is Greg that is here to talk. Greg Strip, aka Ghost Crawler. He comes from Riot Games. He's one of the designers behind big, big, big titles like League of Legends that you know, for instance. And he's going to explain very interesting stuff because he's so talented through professional. He knows about the business that you love, right? After 20 minutes of talk or something like that, we will open it for questions. And Greg, he will invite you to ask, ask, ask. So take advantage of the opportunity because it's so unique. So please, big applause for Greg Street. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Hola. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a beautiful space, and I have enjoyed the 4 days that I've spent in Barcelona here. It's been very beautiful. I understand this weather is more typical, but I've been telling everyone I'm from California, so I'm used to the sun all the time. I don't mind seeing a little rain once in a while, so it's been great. I'll just talk a little bit about my background and kind of how I got here. I've been making video games for about 20 years now. I've worked only on 3 real titles, Age of Empires, World of Warcraft, and now League of Legends. But I didn't start as a game designer. Back 20 years ago, there were maybe no university programs to study making video games at all, let alone game design. So I was a scientist. I studied oceanography, and the story I like to tell is that when I was in graduate school, I spent a lot of time out on the oceans, in the water, getting muddy, always outside. I didn't have any money, but it was very beautiful, and I enjoyed it a lot. And then I got my degree, and all of a sudden I was spending all of my time in front of a computer. And I was writing grant proposals and writing papers, and I never got outside anymore. And my colleagues, we would have dinner, and my colleagues after dinner would go back to the lab to work on their experiments, and I would go home and play video games. And I decided this made me a very bad scientist compared to my colleagues because they really loved what they were doing, and I didn't really love it. And it is a very hard job that doesn't have a lot of benefits. Really, the main benefit is you love what you're doing, and it wasn't something that I loved. But I did play a lot of video games. And at the time, game designer was just starting to become a discipline. At the time, most games were made by programmers. They would write the code, they would also do the art and the sound and do the whole package together. But as games got larger and larger, the teams needed to start differentiating and bringing in people from different disciplines. So I read an interview with a designer. His name is Bruce Shelley. He worked on Age of Empires. He also worked on games like Civilization and Railroad Tycoon. And in this interview, he said that his new studio was hiring designers with no experience. And I said, that's me, I have no experience. And so to apply for this job, they wanted me to make a map for Age of Empires because we would make this single player campaign, and it had all of these historical maps. So we would tell like the story of Joan of Arc, and you'd play through 6 maps to kind of recreate the battles that she fought in. And so I had no idea how to make a map for Age of Empires. I loved the game because I liked the history, but I didn't know anything about making maps. I stayed up all night on the internet kind of researching what are all the different tricks you can use to make maps. And I sent one in. And the team was like, hey, this is pretty good. We'd like to interview you. And that interview ultimately turned into a job offer, and I moved and became a game designer. Now, my first job, my table looked like, it was like a folding table, and I shared space with a photocopier for the office. I think I was outside in the hallway, and people would just come by. But I loved it. Now I was working on something that I really loved, and after dinner, I would want to go back and either we would play games, or we'd play the game we were working on, or we would work on the project some more. And I stayed there ultimately for 10 years, working on Age of Empires, then Age of Empires 2, Age of Empires 3. We made a game called Age of Mythology, where we broke a little bit from the history and added some fantastical elements. And I really enjoyed what I was doing. We're kind of making the same game over and over again, but really, really brilliant people I got to work with, and I loved it a lot. And then one day, I noticed that all of my friends were talking about this new game that had come out. At the time, we were in crunch, so we were working extra long hours to make a milestone, and we would have dinner brought into the office, and everyone was eating dinner, and they're talking about this game. And I got really tired of hearing about this game all the time. And I remember saying, look, if you're going to talk about this game, I'm going to go sit at another table because I'm sick of hearing about this. And they said, no, just try it. You'll understand. You've never seen anything like this before. And you've probably guessed that the game I'm talking about is World of Warcraft. And so I tried it, and I said, okay, I understand. This is something special. I've never seen anything like this before. And I fell in love with the game really hard. And before too long, I was sending out company emails about like what, we had gone and raided Molten Core, Blackwing Lair, and I would write up emails about, what had happened to the company guild that night. And so nobody at the studio was surprised when I applied to Blizzard to go work on World of Warcraft, and I got that job. It worked out at the time that the lead designer on World of Warcraft, a guy named Jeff Kaplan, he went off to do a new game that ultimately, after many, many years and many adventures, became Overwatch. And so they needed a backfill in World of Warcraft, and that's where I came in. On WoW, we split the design tasks in half, and my colleague led what we called content design. So this is like making the levels, making the quests, kind of telling the story, while my side was the systems design side. So we would build the classes, create items, build the, balance the economy, PvP, combat, things like that. And I worked on World of Warcraft for 6 years, for many expansions. Blizzard is a wonderful place to work, and I learned an awful lot from my colleagues there. For example, when I started out at Ensemble, sometimes, I'd have an idea on the drive into work, and so when I got in, I would make a change to the game, and then we'd play test it to see if it was good. And most of the time, it was not good, and so we'd take it back out of the game again. I had heard that Blizzard was very iterative with the way they did game design, so I expected to do more of this, but I actually found out that wasn't true. The way Blizzard does design is they think very, very deeply about a problem first, and then once they've thought a lot about it and beat it up and people have kind of poked holes in it, then we would build it in the game. And at that point, it had a much higher chance of success, right? We'd already been, we'd thought about it very deeply before we did the work of putting it in the game. And then even once it was in the game, then we would iterate a lot as well. This is a theme I'm probably going to come back to a lot this morning, is talking about a really good way, I think, to make any kind of software, but certainly to build games, is to think about what are your goals? What are you really trying to accomplish? And then what do you have to do to meet those goals? And everything that isn't about meeting those goals is probably not important, and is probably just a distraction that's going to slow you and your team down to ultimately creating the product you want. So I was at, like I said, I was at Blizzard for 6 years. Really, really smart people. I really loved the community. I spent a lot of effort talking to players, trying to get them to understand how we think about things. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? Even if players didn't agree with the particular change we'd make, at least they would understand why we were trying to make something. And then one day, I was in Shanghai at a conference called China Joy, which is an unbelievably massive game conference. Just literally hundreds of thousands of people at this conference going to the booths and talking to people. It's like Gamescom times, I don't know, 4, 5, 10, something like that. It's just massive. And I was up on stage doing something kind of like this, talking to, players are asking questions. And I look across the hall, and I see this booth, and there's thousands of players at this booth. And I'm like, what is this game? Is this a Chinese game I hadn't heard of before? And someone said, oh, no, that's League of Legends. And I was like, I thought that was a Dota clone. Like, when did this game get so popular? And I hadn't really been paying attention, but almost overnight, this game had exploded. And I knew that League of Legends was built by a company called Riot, which was also in California, not too far away from Blizzard. And I had some friends who had gone up there. And I thought, maybe I need to pay a little more attention. I was really happy at Blizzard, but this seemed to be a phenomenon that was going on that I had missed. So I started talking to some people at Riot, and I found out really quickly, yes, League of Legends was a great game, but Riot was a company that really was, matched my values as a player. It was very dear to my heart. For example, Riot places the player experience above everything. We try to be a very, very player-focused game company. Almost every question we have is usually answered by, well, what's in the best interest for players? What are they going to get out of this? At Blizzard, sometimes when I would talk to players, I think it would ruffle feathers sometimes from my bosses. And at Riot, the company says, no, everyone should go out and talk to players. That's the most important thing. Let players understand what it is, that's valuable to us. And so I felt like, this is a company that I think, I'd like to be a part of. And so I moved over to Riot to work on League of Legends, and I've been there a little over 4 years now. It was the right decision. Again, Blizzard is a wonderful company. I would never say anything bad about them. But for me, I think Riot really matches what I want to do as a game developer. So just a little bit about my job. I've described it as mostly going to meetings, because a lot of what I do is review work where someone will say, hey, we've made a new champion. These are the goals that we were trying to accomplish with the champion. Why don't you take a look and tell us what you think? And we have a very strong feedback culture. So I might say, like, hey, I'm a little concerned that players will think this champion looks very strong and tanky, but that's actually not how she plays out. So there may be some clarity issues here. Why don't we change the art a little bit to make her less tanky, or why don't we actually change her abilities to make her feel more like a big sturdy character? I also work with the other leads. So we have the lead artist, the lead engineer, everyone on League of Legends. So we talk about what are we prioritizing for the upcoming 6 months or 12 months to make sure that the entire team, because we have a very large development team for a game like League of Legends. And so we talk about what are we going to prioritize? What are our big bets for the upcoming year? I also manage the design department and the narrative department for League of Legends. It's about 60, I don't even remember, 50, let's say 50, 60 people. And then I'm ultimately accountable for the design of League of Legends. So even though I can't possibly make every decision myself, when we make a bad mistake, it's my fault. Like, if balance is off, it's my fault. I try to create an environment in which good decisions get made. So when bad decisions happen, even if I didn't directly do it, I'm the one accountable for it. Lately, I've been getting a little more involved with the R&D projects we have at Riot. We are a game company with one game, and it's a very successful game. But overall, we like to say that the company's called Riot Games with a plural, and so we want to have more than one game someday. So trying to help the teams get a second or third game out there. I think that's probably a good place to leave it. I'd like to have plenty of time to talk about what you guys would like to talk about. So I think we can move on and talk about any questions you have. Sound good? Cool. So I don't know how we want to do this. Do you want me just to pick people out, or do we need a microphone for? Okay.
You have the water. We were thinking about bringing you the water.
Oh.
Hola, hola. Hello, hello. Yeah, it works.
Hi, Greg. Thank you
Hi.
for coming. My question is about community interaction. I think you could talk about. Like, I guess the question would be, any tips for dealing with an online game community, which can be a little bit rude or toxic, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah.
When dealing it in a more personal level, like you do, maybe like you are not patch notes, you are like Greg, the like lead team designer.
Yeah.
So you're kind of exposing yourself to the community. And would you recommend it? I guess you're recommended, but any tips on doing that?
Yeah. So the first thing I always try to remember is players are talking about the game because they're passionate about it, and when they're angry about something, it's because they care. And ultimately, you would much rather have that response in players than have them say, like, whatever you do, we don't care. We don't really care about your game. So it's a good thing to have a very engaged fan base, right? The second thing I try to remember is what it's like from their point of view. They're probably very frustrated because to them they see a problem with the game. You know, why don't those stupid developers just understand all they have to do is, like, you know, make this change to this champion and everything will be good. And they can't get us to understand that. So it's a point of frustration for them. You know, we're in the position of power. We ultimately make the changes. And so when they feel like we're not listening, an easy thing to do is just, you know, be louder, be more obnoxious, say extreme things to try to get noticed. So I always try to remember that that's where they're coming from. And even if they are struggling to express themselves in a way that is, you know, maybe professional, that's, you know, that's what's in their heart. That's what they're trying to do. So I never take it personally. And overall, I've found I've probably met, gosh, thousands of players, you know, face to face in environments like this or at game conferences or things like that. I've never had anyone be rude to my face. And that's not a challenge. We don't need to start today. But which I think just shows that they ultimately do care, and they're working on the same things we are, which is to make the game better overall. And sometimes when they're on the internet and they can't necessarily see that there's a human on the other side, it's easier to be a little more extreme. Great question.
Hi. One of the best points of League of Legends is that every champion have his own personality and his own gameplay. And my question is, where do you get the inspiration for achieve that? And how do you know that a champion will work before launching it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can break down the inspiration in kind of two main halves. One is the team will just get excited about something they see. Like maybe it's a comic book or a movie, and they'll say like, oh, I really like the way this character you know, moves up walls, or I really like the way this character, you know, their personality is interesting. And so that's one way a character can begin. A character like Jinx, I believe the artist just made a painting and said, look, we should make this champion. And everyone's like, yes, we will make that champion. And she's awesome. I love Jinx. The other main way that a champion can get created is the team says, we feel like there's a need that's not served. Like when we made Braum, a lot of the support champions at the time were kind of these, you know, wispy female caster types. And so a lot of players were saying, we want a manly support. So we made Braum, this big, you know, manly support. Very, very nice guy, but, you know, big, strong, beefy, uses a shield to protect his allies. His identity and like what he looks like and his personality, that all came out later. For a long time, he was just the manly support character. Kindred just started out as jungle marksman, and for a long time we just called those champions jungle marksmen because we didn't know what else they were going to be. And so that's a different way. In terms of how do we know the character will resonate with players, I mean, ultimately we don't. It's a little bit of a, you know, we're taking a chance, but we try to mitigate the risk because everyone who works on League of Legends plays League of Legends. We don't have people that don't play the game. And I think that's, if I could give you a piece of advice when you're working on a project, make sure everyone on the project regularly engages with the game because you can find out what's working, what's not working, that things may be working differently than you expect. So because we play the game, we have a pretty good idea of when a champion, you know, won't work and when players will say, this doesn't make sense in League of Legends. And then the other thing we do is test it a lot. We'll bring in players, you know, non-rioters to come in and try the champion out, and we'll get feedback from them like, oh, I didn't understand how to use their Q, or once I fell behind in lane, I didn't have a solution, you know, things like that. And then finally, one of the pillars upon which Riot was built is that we wanted to regularly update the game. And we patch League of Legends every 2 weeks so that if there's something wrong, whether that's a balance problem or a bug or a champion that just doesn't feel right, we always have time to kind of react and fix it. So before I mentioned that, Ensemble would iterate by just putting stuff in the game and trying it. And then Blizzard would iterate by thinking very deeply about a problem and then putting it in the game and trying it. Riot does all of that, but then even once we put it in the game, we don't consider it done. We put it out in front of players and see, does it resonate with players? Do players like it? And then we kind of keep working on it even after it's gone live.
Hi there. My question is, how from game design can we manage to solve or at least control players' toxicity in the game? In League of Legends, for example?
Yeah. I mean, competitive games are, they can be frustrating, right? You fall behind, you can't win, even though you feel like you're doing everything right, you see that the enemy score is higher. That can be a frustrating experience. Multiplayer games, by their very nature, tend to have like high energy, high adrenaline. You know, you can feel yourself getting very excited. A great game that does this is PUBG, where you can see everyone who's playing PUBG is like always amped up on adrenaline all the time. And we have found that most of the time when we have a player behavior problem, it's not someone who's just a jerk trying to ruin the game for everyone else. Almost all the time, it's a very normal person who had a bad day, or they just had a bad game, and they kind of say something stupid before they really think about it. So the strategy we try to take is just to remind people, like, hey, that thing you said, that probably didn't make the other players on your team feel very good. We understand that it's a video game, and like some amount of trolling and some amount of, you know, what we call trash talking, that's normal. It's a competitive game, and that's fine. We just want it to, you know, we don't want it to be a place that is, you know, racist or sexist or homophobic or makes people feel bad. A solution that's worked out pretty well for us is we now use machine learning to help us identify when players say things that historically other players would report them for. It just kind of helps us be very reactive. Rather than having to wait for other players to report inappropriate language, we can say, oh, you said something that is kind of the kind of thing that players report often, so we're just going to go ahead and give you a warning now. That system ends up being really useful because internet slang evolves very, very quickly, and it's hard for humans to kind of keep up with, hey, when someone said GG, did they mean that was good, or were they kind of insulting you? And it sometimes can be very hard to tell. So we've had some luck with that. This last year, we relaunched the honor feature in League of Legends. This is to kind of reward positive play, not just negative play. We felt like a lot of times we had used the, in English, the idiom is we used the stick but not the carrot. So we worked on punishment without trying to kind of reward good behavior. And so we feel like the honor system has helped, and we know from asking players that they feel like now we kind of complete the package. Not only do we punish people, but we also reward them when they are cooperative or when they don't get stressed out under fire, things like that. I think it will continue to be a problem in multiplayer games. You know, I see it in any competitive game I engage in. I don't think there's anything particularly unusual about the League of Legends community that way. I think it's just gamers and getting excited about the game you're playing.
So, hi.
Hi.
My question is, when designing new champions and rewards in a game with a roster so large as League of Legends, how do you find, or what difficulties do you find when trying to find the balance between mixing up things that already exist in the game and making up new stuff, like, for example, new stuff, Cassiopeia's ground status, or like Echo's Q, which is already similar to other abilities?
So I can answer that in two different ways. Back when League of Legends was still a fairly young game, say around 2012, we were just trying to add champions as fast as we could. We would literally make a champion in 2 weeks. And many of these champions feel like they were made in 2 weeks because they're either very simplistic or they have game problems, or maybe their art just doesn't look good, or maybe their theme doesn't seem like it matches League of Legends. Sometimes it feels too much like someone just took a character out of a comic book and stuck it right in League. These days, now that the game has 140 champions, we feel like the barrier is much higher. And to justify creating a new champion, we think it needs to add something that players have never seen before. Zoe is a great example where the designer said, look, we have a lot of mages in the game. I don't want to just make another mage. I want to make something with a bunch of abilities that no one has seen in League of Legends before. Because there is a big switching cost for players to pick up a new champion. We wanted to, to kind of earn that. A different way to do it is when we released Duo, Xayah and Recon. What was unusual about that champion is just that we were releasing 2 champions at once, which is something we hadn't done in many, many years. So there's a lot of ways we can just try to make it feel like this is something new to players. In terms of ability design, it's very easy. These days, a champion, I said our champions used to take 2 weeks. These days, our champions could take 6 or 8 months. And it's very easy in that time for a designer to say, okay, I like the Q and the W, but the E is a little lame, so I'm going to work on the E and make something exciting. Then a few weeks later, okay, now the E is good, but the W, which I liked a few weeks ago, now it's starting to feel bad. And so you keep raising the bar. That could be good to some extent because you're making sure that every ability on the champion is really cool, but it can also lead to complexity when you have all of this stuff packed into each and every ability. So what I try to encourage the team to do is say, look, if you're going to have a really complicated interaction on the champion queue, let's make sure that other parts of the champion kit are a little more straightforward. Like, it's okay once in a while just to have a dumb boring shield that you cast and helps protect you from damage. Again, I would say this goes back to goal setting, is I'll ask, well, what is the goal of this champion? What are we trying to create? If this champion is intended to be a very mobile marksman, okay, great. Let's focus most of our design effort on that mobility because that's really what's supposed to be special about her. More questions? Must be too early in the morning. Oh, there we go.
Hello. Before getting anything out of the game and being official, like champions or jungle or monsters, do you ask the veterans of the game if it would be a good idea to put it in the game?
I missed that last part. If we would do what?
If it would be a good idea to put in the game. The new champs, the new monsters, if it would be a good idea to put it.
How do we decide if it would be a good idea?
Yeah.
I mean, overall, it comes down to what are we trying to accomplish? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? A lot of game design is solving problems. And the problem may be that something as simple as the jungler gets bored between 2 and 3 minutes in the game because there's nothing to do. Or it could be that the dragon is such an attractive objective that people ignore other objectives in the map and the game just all becomes about the dragon. So we talk a lot about what is it that we're trying to solve? And if we can all agree on what we're trying to solve, then the discussion comes down to how do we solve it? And like as a leader, I'm much less interested in the specifics of how we solve it, and I try to focus more on what is it that we're trying to accomplish. So I try to operate kind of at the level of strategy and leave the tactics to the designers who actually, are very familiar with the problems. Let me just add that we try not to make change for the sake of change. We try to always make changes that improve the game over time. We don't just I call it tinkering if a designer is just like, oh, I want to try this and see what happens. We think that can sometimes lead to messy changes.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is about the art of League of Legends. So, did Riot think about making an art book of his work until now?
Yeah, there is an art book of League of Legends work. I have it. I'm not sure how it's available. It's a pretty big book that has a lot of the art, not only about champions, but about Summoner's Rift and other parts of the game. I really like our art style. I feel like it's very approachable. You can look at it and generally understand what's going on, yet I also feel like it's uniquely League of Legends, and particularly as we get more out of Summoner's Rift and into the world at large, I really like some of the art we've done for the cities, like Noxus or Piltover. I think those look really cool and feel very unique.
Hi.
Hi.
A generic question is, when it comes to game design, what do you think is the most difficult thing to solve?
The most difficult thing to solve?
Yeah, balancing doesn't count.
I mean, there's a lot of difficult things to solve. Overall, I would say the main challenge you're trying to solve as a game designer is to keep players engaged. So if you make a game, say you make a game like Uncharted that you expect to take, 30 hours to finish, maybe less, you want to make sure that players are enjoying the entire journey and that they don't get bored and give up. You want to make sure that the game is providing a challenge to them, because if the game isn't challenging, they'll be like, I'm not really interested. I don't feel like my decisions really matter here. I'm just kind of going through the motions to see the story. But you also don't want to make it so difficult that they hit a wall and get frustrated and quit. You can frustrate players a little bit and have them rise to the occasion, but if you push them too hard, you may just get them to stop playing. And there are a lot of games that I quit at the final boss because often designers make the final boss so challenging, and I'll reach it and I'll say, why am I still playing this game? Like, I'm going to beat the boss and then turn the game off. Like, even if I get a new reward, I'm not going to use that reward, so I'm kind of at the end of the game anyway. So I'd say overall that's the biggest challenge. A common challenge we run into for League of Legends is the balancing for such a diverse audience. where we have everything from literal professional players who do this for a living and play games all day long to relatively new players or people that may only play an hour a month or something like that. Making sure that we have the same set of numbers that work for all of those players is hugely challenging. But we also feel like it's very important. There are some sports where the size of the field will shrink for, say, school children versus university students versus professionals. But we think in League of Legends it's really important that the game works the same for everyone. It's really important that when you go look up, oh, I'm going to try Echo. I've never played Echo, so I'm going to Google like a good Echo player. I'm probably going to get a pro or someone who's very skilled, and I want to be able to see what they're doing and follow that, and not have someone say, oh, the damage works totally differently, when you're in a professional environment. So we make our lives very hard on ourselves by saying, look, we're going to balance the game with one set of numbers, but we think it's important.
Hi. My question is about the current game. Do you know if Riot is going to apply some new mod games and not like the rotative one once a week, so another type of map or something like that?
A new mod games? You mean like the ERF or the temporary events we run, like that, or?
Like the Red Moon event. The map is going red and only play assassins.
Oh, yeah, changing the map skins, yes.
Yeah, but not that once game mode for weeks. One map like the abysm of for example, the twist forest.
Yeah.
Something like that.
So there's a couple different ways to answer that. For a long time, our map was very handmade by the artist. So like it was just one giant file with all of the geometry put into place, which of course makes it very, very hard to ever change because you have to take the entire file and redo it. We've put a lot of work into breaking it down into a more component-based design so that now it's easier for us to do things like change the map red or put snow in the map. Or around the time Worlds comes around, we'll put some textures into the ground just to kind of remind players something special is going on. We've been focusing a lot lately on creating events for players. It used to be we would make skins and say, hey, why don't you buy some skins? And it would just feel like all we were doing was selling things, because that's exactly what it was. Today, we would rather say, like, look, there's an event going on in League of Legends, and there's a certain story that we're trying to tell and certain themes that you'll see. And now we have a mission system. So if you participate in this event, you can earn rewards and things like that. And then we will also make skins that kind of tie into this event because honestly, that is how we stay in business because we're a free-to-play game. So it's very important to us that players buy some cosmetic content so we can pay the bills. And we've been experimenting with changing up the maps for those events. We've talked about what does it look like if we just let players purchase a map skin. One of the challenges there is that if I purchase like a new skin for my Ashe, everyone sees it. But sometimes, say there's 10 players in the game and they all want a different map, we'd have to decide how to solve that problem. It's not an impossible problem to solve, but there's just some challenges there.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is about when you are creating a new character in the game, what do you do first? You have a background about the story of the character, and then you create the mechanic of it, or you think about the mechanics first, and then you create a background for the story of the character?
Usually the mechanics come first. Usually the team will realize that they want to make a champion based around a certain ability or a certain play style, and then the artists and the writers will collaborate, say, okay, if this is going to be a fast-moving champion, let's think about characters that make sense here. Now there are some exceptions. I mentioned Jinx was mostly made because someone said, I painted this champion, we should make her. And she's actually a really good example because the art and gameplay built upon each other in a really good way. Like Jinx's passive is called Get Excited in English. It means that as she does damage, she does even more and more damage. So it makes her get really reckless, which plays in really well to her personality. She's supposed to be kind of crazy and unpredictable, and her gameplay reinforces that play style. Like, you don't really play cautious with this champion. You kind of go out there and act a little crazy. I think that's a great example where the art and the gameplay built on each other. I think we have other champions that are perfectly good champions, but the ability doesn't necessarily say, oh, this is what that champion is all about. You take someone like Garen, who's supposed to be like this very noble knight and very powerful and defender of his country, and the way players often play him is to kind of hide in brush and then jump out and spin around in circles. So I don't think that necessarily sells the idea of who Garen is supposed to be, but that's been in the game so long, I don't think we could change it at this point.
Hi. We are all students, and after that, we will go to work in companies like Riot or like. And a first touch with these companies is to get an internship. So, what are the best ways to get an internship with these companies?
Riot has an internship program. I think a lot of studios do. It's a great way to kind of try before you buy. Like, you get to see if someone is actually a good worker and a good culture fit before you make a long-term commitment. And it's good for the student as well, because you can say, wow, I thought I would enjoy doing this, but this is not at all what I thought. So I hope we see even more internships in the future. Riot is a very large company now, and we've probably done about all we can do by kind of like recruiting from our competitors at this point. So we really are looking to students as like, what is the, who are the future awesome people that we want to get at the company, and how can we, kind of make a claim on them early before some other company competes for them. In order to like get an internship, I give you the same advice that I would give you trying to get a job, which is studios like Riot get many, many applications. We might get 500 game design applications in a week. And probably many of those people are outstanding and we should hire them, but we just don't know that. And it's hard to filter through all of those. I could spend my entire day just calling people and talking to them and saying like, oh, this seems like, this designer would be really strong. We want to hire her. And if I did that, obviously, I wouldn't have time to make the game. So a different strategy is to have recruiters whose job is to call people all the time, and we do that, but the recruiter is not a game designer and may not understand at the end of the day exactly what we're looking for. The recruiter may say, oh, this person plays a lot of games, and then I may say, yeah, but these are all strange games, and I'd really want to understand why this person loves all these games so much. I wouldn't really disqualify someone for that, but so the thing you need to do is figure out a way to stand out. Now, sometimes I say that, and people say, oh, so I'm going to make my font really unusual and make my background colored and things like that. That's not the right way to do it. You want to stand out because you've accomplished something that nobody else has done. A great way to do this is to make a game with things like the availability of Unreal and Unity now. It's not unreasonable for a group of students to get together and make something. If you can say, look, go download this from Steam or the App Store, that's like the best you could possibly do. But it doesn't have to be that far along either. If you can't make an entire game, maybe you can make a mod for an existing game. Maybe you can run a fan site for a game that you really love and feel like you have a lot of insight into why people visit your area. Maybe you're a streamer who has a reasonably large following, but part of kind of your brand as a streamer is you can talk with a lot of insight into the games that you're playing. Rather than saying, oh, that was cool, you might say, oh, well, the reason this monster jumped out the way they did is because the developer was trying to, create a certain emotion in people going through the level. It's kind of anything you can do to say, I'm going to be able to do awesome things once I get to your company. Just writing that down, words are cheap and anyone can say that. So anytime you can say, look, I made something. If you can't make a digital game, make a card game or a board game. One of my colleagues I always quote says, if you don't enjoy making a card game, you're probably not going to enjoy making the next Halo, because they're not that different at the end of the day. The tools are very different, and one takes a lot longer and a lot more people, but you're still kind of solving the same problems. You're trying to communicate a vision to the team. You're trying to prioritize and cut features that you really, really love but just can't figure out a way to support, and so on. The good news is the industry is growing, and because of the kind of the tools I talked about, it's easier than ever for smaller teams to actually make great games that get discovered. a lot of people at Riot are playing a game right now called Slay the Spire, which was a team of like 2 people, but they made a great game. It's low on art because it's hard for 2 people to make a lot of art, but the gameplay is very rich.
Hello. My question is about.
Where are you? Oh, hi.
My question is about the map creation, about the jungle, NPC locations, and how do you make the PvP systems to be enjoyable?
What, I missed the last part. What the
PvP system to be more enjoyable, like making the ganking system to be funny.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing with the mic.
The ganking system. Ganking other players, and how do you make it more funny? Yeah, and how do you make it to be more playable with the team about ganking one lane?
So a big part, every now and then we try to change the way the jungle works in League of Legends. I'm assuming here that you guys know a lot about League of Legends, but just really quickly, players have found that it's more gold efficient to send one player out of lane into what we call the jungle, which is just kind of the trees and forests of the map, and earn gold that way. They can kill monsters and get gold in a different way than just killing minions in lane. And so one of the things junglers do is when they've killed all the camps, there's nothing to do, they'll go find a lane and try to gang up and surprise someone. And a lot of the early strategy of the game comes down to which lane do you attack and how good are you at coordinating with lane and things like that. We've tried to offer additional strategies for junglers. For example, we've tried to encourage a strategy that's just around farming. Like I stay in the jungle the whole time and just get really, really powerful, and I don't really come out into lane very often. But one of the problems we've had is that the other players have this expectation the jungler is going to help them out. And so when the jungler is just like going through the jungle all the time and not coming out at all, they'll be like, what are you doing? Why aren't you like participating in this game? You're just off playing your own game. We also tried to encourage counter jungling a little bit, where you go out of your jungle and you go into the enemy's jungle and kind of deny them their camps. That's kind of a high risk, high reward situation. We see higher skill players do that sometimes. It's a pretty bold move for a less experienced player to like go into the enemy jungle and try to be effective there. So it's an interesting case where we've tried to open up more strategies for players, but the response we often get from players like, no, I don't really want to do this. I don't find this fun. We also have to be very careful not to shift things too far in one way or the other. If ganking is super effective all the time, you feel like the game basically comes down to who has the most skilled jungler on their team. On the other hand, if it's never effective, the jungler is not going to risk it. They're just going to farm for a while until they get powerful and then fight towards the end of the game. So it's been a tough thing, and one of the reasons we've worked on it so much has been kind of a tough design to change perceptions.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is, which champion have you enjoyed designing the most?
Which champion have I enjoyed designing the most? I was really excited about the Xayah and Recon, because at the time we had come off a series of fairly complicated champions. Like we made Talia, and the idea was, oh, she's going to be pretty simple and straightforward. And as time went on, she got more and more complicated, and we realized, okay, this is a niche champion now. This isn't a mainstream champion. So I really challenged the team to say, like, who's going to be the next Lux? Just a champion who has a lot of depth, but the abilities are pretty easy to understand. The tooltips are not, 3 paragraphs trying to explain everything they do. And so the team came up with this story of, we're going to make 2 fairly simple champions. I think Recon ended up being a little more complicated than Xayah, but what's going to be special is we're going to make them as a couple, and we're going to release them at the same time. And players are going to be surprised they're getting not 1 champion, but 2 of them. And we're going to add a little bit of synergy so that if someone on your team picks one, you are maybe encouraged to pick the other one. That was very hard for us to design so that it felt optional. We didn't want it to feel like, oh, if you pick Xayah, the support player has to pick Recon. But because of the way their back to base works out, there's a slight advantage, very slight, if you pick both of them together. So I think that was a lot of fun, because I presented the team with a challenge and I wasn't sure how they were going to solve it, and that was kind of the solution they came up with.
Hi.
what new skills do you think League of Legends will develop graphically in a close future?
What skills?
Will develop graphically.
What skills will roll?
What new skills like?
Sorry, I have trouble. So for a long time, League of Legends was what I would call like a dexterity-based game. So you really were a good player if you could click fast or you could line up skill shots or things like that. We're trying to shift the game a little bit back towards a game that rewards good intelligence and smart decision making as well. And ideally, we get both. Like, if you look at a game like chess, there's very little dexterity involved. It's mostly outthinking the opponent. And then if you look at a card game like poker, you're not only outthinking the opponent, you're trying to bluff them and you're trying to fake them out and trying to get into their head psychologically. And I think League of Legends is at its strongest when all of those skills are being called into play. We don't think you should be effective just because you're very good at mouse execution, but you don't understand the game. I talked once to, I can't remember the team, but I talked to a woman who was a coach for one of the EU teams, and she got very frustrated because she had this player who wouldn't learn any of the champion abilities because he was so good at moving the mouse around that it didn't matter. He didn't need to learn it because he could just outplay anyone just by clicking around the map. Ideally, that's not the skill set we want to promote. We want a little bit of that because having a fast-paced game keeps things exciting. But we want to make sure it's a game for people with good hand-eye coordination as well as good strategic depth.
Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Streaming platforms has become more and more popular over the years. So, in your opinion, what do you think would be the aspects to consider for a game designer? Not about only the player, but the spectators.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more. I think League of Legends would not have been nearly as successful as it was without Twitch specifically or streaming coming along at the same time. I mean, I really give a lot of credit to that for the game getting as big as it is. So I would definitely encourage, if you make a game, think about what is the spectator experience. When we design for professional play, when we design for esports, we are really focused on what is the viewer experience. Because esports doesn't work if no one wants to watch it. And it's just a bunch of very skilled players, you know, in a room with no one around. We know that players are less likely to enjoy esports when there's not a lot of action. And pros, by their very nature, try to be cautious. Like, they don't want to embarrass themselves or their teams. They always play more conservatively. And part of what we do is always try to tempt them into taking a risk, because the risky plays are what really gets fans excited. So I would try to think that way in terms of streaming. Like, if you're watching someone else play the game, what is interesting about that experience? If they're spending a lot of time in menus, or they're doing a lot of manipulation of their inventory, you know, that's probably not very exciting to watch. Action is exciting to watch. It's also exciting when the streamer isn't sure what's going to happen next, and maybe they're predicting a little bit. They're like, well, I know the enemy is around here somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where they are. They're kind of telling a story, and I think that drama is what wraps up the viewers and makes you kind of want to come back and watch those streamers more. We've been trying more and more to partner with streamers for League of Legends, because we find, particularly for younger players, but I think everyone these days, they would much rather get a recommendation from someone they consider a peer, someone who plays a lot of games and can recommend a game. So we would rather have a prominent League streamer say, yeah, I tried out this new champion and she's really cool, maybe you want to check her out. That's just a lot more authentic coming from another player than coming from Riot saying, hey, please buy this champion and give us money. By the same token, if that player says, hey, I tried out this new champion and I didn't like her, we don't mind that either for two reasons. One is it makes sure that their street cred is still there. Like, if they don't like everything we do, then you're more likely to believe them when they do say they really like something. And secondly, we just want to know if they think this champion isn't going to be very fun. That's really good information for us to have. It's kind of a no-lose situation for us. It's a great question. How are we doing on time?
Hello, hello, Rick. You have worked for 20 years as game design, and I would ask what things you think are the best things you learned about working as game design to tell us and to become a greater one.
Sure. So the number one thing, the hardest part, the most important part of the job is teamwork. It's very hard to make a game with one person. And even if you have a very small team of 2 or 3 people, you have to work with other people. And it can be a very frustrating experience if you don't agree. Maybe you don't agree on what the game should be, or maybe you agree on what the game should be, but you don't agree about your work system. Like an extreme case may be you want to work in the morning after breakfast and stop after lunch, and your partner wants to stay up all night and work. Any kind of conflict like that makes making a game harder. I was talking to a student group, yesterday, and I said, building the team is harder than building the game. Once you get a good team, you can do almost anything with that team. But if you are constantly arguing and you don't get along and you don't even agree on what you're building, it can be a miserable experience, and people just want to quit at that point. So one of the most important skills of being a game designer is communication. You need to be able to communicate with players. You need to be able to communicate with engineers. You want them to build you something, and you have to explain what it is you want them to build. You spend a lot of time talking to the team. When we overhauled the rune system for League of Legends this past winter, I spent a lot of time just explaining why we were going to do this to the team, because it was a huge project, and people wanted to understand, like, what are our goals? Why do we think this is the part of the game we need to invest in when we could spend those resources? We could make more champions. We could do other new features. Why was runes the main thing? So you really have to get good at communicating in order to be a designer. Another really important skill is to keep an open mind. Being a designer is a weird mix of being objective and being subjective. You need to be subjective to come up with cool ideas that get people excited and will give players entertaining moments. But you also have to be really willing to admit when your ideas aren't working. We sometimes call this, you need to be able to kill your babies. You get very, very excited about something. Like, this is going to be so good, and then you start to implement it or you even start to test it, and you're like, okay, this is a bad idea. We're going to stop doing that. You often see junior designers, they get really excited about something, they're unwilling to let it go, even when they're faced with a lot of evidence that their idea isn't working. At that point, they're just kind of wasting time that they could be spent working on something that actually does have a bigger chance for success. So you have to be somewhat resilient. You have to know when your idea has a chance and when you just need to iterate a little bit more. But you also have to know when you're just going in the wrong direction. You need to stop and do something else.
Hi.
Hi.
The question is, are you now working in new projects? Are you developing new projects at this moment?
Developing new projects?
Yes.
Yeah, I said before that we want to put the S in Riot Games and have multiple games. One of the challenges is typically games ship when the developers run out of money. And this can happen because you have an investor, and the investor says, hey, I want a return on my investment. Maybe you have a deal with a publisher, and the publisher says, we agreed that you were going to complete certain milestones. Maybe it's just you and your friends, and your friend is like, hey, I really need to pay rent and buy some food, and we're not going to get any money until this game is out there. Because League of Legends has been successful, Riot can afford to take a long time to make our next game, and we are taking a very long time to make our next game. And so part of what I'm trying to focus on with a lot of other people in the studio is figuring out how do we determine when something is good enough? Like, when is a game great? Because the reality is, none of our other games are going to be as successful as League, and we know that. League has 100 million players in the world. That's unprecedented, and many games would be thrilled to have 2 or 3 million players. So I think we just need to be happy knowing that we're going to make a great game that players love, even if it doesn't recreate the amazing phenomenon that League had.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, morning as well. And I want to ask that when you're balancing the game, sometimes you feel like some changes take ages to come into the game like, oh, this character is overpowered. Why did it take like 3 months to actually nerf it? Or when you're actually balancing a class in World of Warcraft, why is it like it's underpowered for also 3 months and it doesn't get changed? What are the priorities? Exactly what decisions does the team have to make in order to balance the game properly?
Yeah, so when we don't make a change, it's usually for a number of reasons. One is we're not convinced it's a problem yet. Like sometimes, for example, a new champion will always come out with a low win rate because nobody knows how to play her yet. And we know that win rate will change over time. And so we don't want to overreact and buff a champion when it first launches just because the win rate is low. Other times we think one of the joys of playing a strategy game like League of Legends is the experimentation players undertake. And it's really cool when there's a dominant strategy and then players develop a counter strategy for that. So if we react too quickly, we take that away from players, the like exploration and the idea of like, ooh, I have an idea I want to try tonight when I get online. So you have to be careful not to overreact. Sometimes, honestly, we don't know how to fix something. We may have a situation where a champion or a World of Warcraft class is too powerful in some situations and too weak in others, and we don't have a good idea yet of how to fix it. It also may be the case that we have an idea of how to fix it, but technically it's challenging. We may require an engineer to create a new flag or a new bit of script in order to add this extra level of complication, and so that just takes time. Other times we may know that an upcoming change is going to fix things. Like maybe it's not worth iterating a lot on the stats of an item if we know that in 2 patches we're planning on just removing the item altogether. That's just kind of wasted effort on the developer's part, unless it's causing a lot of pain for players. If it's causing a lot, then we might as well do some kind of temporary solution. Trying to think of other times it might change. Sometimes we just don't agree it's a problem. There's no true set of numbers. It's not like a thermometer that says, oh, this champion or this class is overpowered. Usually it's very subjective. We'll look at things like win rates, but as I said, just because someone's win rate is 47% doesn't necessarily mean, oh, we have to buff them right away. We have champions that we know players start complaining about too much if their win rate gets to be up in the 50%. We also have some champions whose win rate is like 53%, which is, too high. But if we nerf the champion, players will be like, what? That champion's fine. We don't need to nerf that champion. Pro tip, Anivia is often in this situation where her win rate is actually higher than players think it is. But we think if we nerfed her, people would be like, why are you nerfing her? She's not a problem. So there's a lot of things that can go into it. I think as a developer, the best thing you can do is try to explain to players why you haven't taken action yet. And then players would be at least help to understand like, oh, they don't know if it's a problem yet, or they know it's a problem, but they just don't know how to fix it yet. I think that can help players. They might still be frustrated, but at least they're not confused about what you think as a developer.
I think that we have time for like one additional final question.
Perfect. Morning.
Very good one.
Morning. I will ask you 2 questions. The
Sure.
first one will be related to game balancing. I think it would be a good idea, given your background, provide some knowledge about some techniques, personal tricks that you use on your regular basis. And the second one, related to what do you think are the next trends on mobile generally?
That's a great question. Okay, so the first one, how to balance. We balance through a lot of different techniques. One is, as I said, everyone plays the game. So often we can detect very early when something is really far off. It's like, wow, I went up against that champion in lane and I felt like I had no options. And maybe I even knew that the player I was playing against was not usually as skilled as I am. That's a pretty good indication something's off. We also, all the game designers on League play the game about 2 times a day. They can't play it much more than that, or they wouldn't have time to like fix bugs and implement changes and things like that. But we also have a professional playtest team that can play many more games a day, sometimes 5, 6 more games. And these players are all very high skilled. Some of them are ex-pro, and so they can give us good insight into what the very high skill levels will be. We also, as I've alluded, we measure a lot of data live. Even as soon as a champion goes out, we can start getting data back right away of, oh, this champion is being banned at a lot higher rate than we expected. Maybe there's something we need to do. We also just talk to players. We look at forums and things like Reddit and YouTube streamers to see what are they saying about the character. And if a lot of players are saying, wow, this character feels too powerful, then that's an indication that maybe we want to look at it. In terms of trends, I mean, That's a great question, and someone who can predict that will make an awful lot of money in this business. I will say one really interesting trend that is happening right now is ever since I got into video games, everyone said, oh, mobile's going to be the next big thing. Mobile's going to be the next big thing. But, I've waited 20 years, and it still hasn't quite happened. One unusual thing that's happening right now, though, is that if you look at list of apps in Europe and North America, a lot of mobile games are still dominated by what we'd consider fairly casual games, things like Candy Crush style. Maybe the most hardcore game we'd see is something like Clash Royale, which I think gets to be a real game. If you look in China right now, the list is dominated by fairly hardcore games. So a lot of MOBAs, a lot of PUBG clones, a lot of first-person shooters. And I think a question we all need to ask ourselves is the rest of the world going to follow China, or is what's happening in China now somehow unusual and mobile games are going to stay fairly casual in the rest of the world? Like, I personally don't play a lot of mobile games yet because I don't like them. But as soon as developers start making games that have a lot of depth and I really enjoy, well, I'll certainly play them more. I think that's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the future. And I think we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the chance to talk to you this morning.
Please don't leave. Don't leave just 1 minute because we will take a shot, a picture with everyone here and Greg in the middle. Okay? So if you can stay, thanks a lot. Okay, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.
Si teniu el link del programa, penseu així m'avises perquè... Sí, perfecte, senyor. No, tardarem avises. Ok, moltes gràcies.